Welcome to another Atypical Philosopher video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. Welcome to all you new subscribers out there. I hope you appreciate the content. What has happened today? Well, not an awful lot on the front lines, although there is some significant, there's a significant sense of the Russians digging in a couple of places. But really the biggest news is what happened overnight. And this appears to have been a huge retaliation from the Russians for the Kerch Bridge attack in Crimea. And I said, initially yesterday, there seemed to be some retaliation immediately in Zaporizhia, predominantly, and a few other places in terms of bombings with the use of a lot of S-300 missiles. These are surface-to-air missiles that do have a secondary mode that can attack the ground, but they are very inaccurate. Well, it turns out they've been using a lot of them recently, and they've been hitting, I guess, with a mixture of cruise missiles and other armaments, places all over Ukraine. Indeed, here is a map of the places that have been hit by overnight bombing right across Ukraine. And in fact, we're going all the way to Lviv. It's just, some might say, senseless attacks against civilians. This is the brutality of the Russians here in terms of what they attack is something that really, really differentiates the Russians from the Ukrainians. And anyone who supports the Russians really rationally should be given pause to question their support. What the Russians do is they either target civilians directly, which is a war crime, end of, that's a war crime. So a bunch of war crimes last night to add to the 30-something thousand that they've already committed and are being investigated for. But and I'm sorry if this sounds too much like opinion and putting my emotions on the line, but it's not. It's like this is what's happened, and this is pretty rational, right? They have either attacked, as in I'm being rational, they've either attacked Ukrainian civilians directly, or they have used munitions that they know are inaccurate and have tried to attack military infrastructure or other types of infrastructure. But because of the inaccuracy of the missiles they're using, they have hit civilian infrastructure and civilian people, civilians. Now, trying to think of an analogy here. If I'm practicing my baseball, okay, my baseball hitting, and I get my bat, and I get someone to chuck a baseball to me, and I'm whacking the baseball as hard as I can, and I'm thinking, right, okay, I'm not that accurate. Anyway, I am going to do my practice next to my neighbour's greenhouse. And if 3 out of the 5 baseballs I'm chucked, I smack into their greenhouse and smash the windows. And I know that I'm pretty inaccurate, but I choose to try and hit the ball as close to the greenhouse as possible, then I am morally culpable for smashing those windows because I know my inaccuracy and I'm pretty certain that I'm going to be smashing a few of those balls into the window. So then when I do my practice near there and I smash those windows, I have at least a great deal of moral culpability for doing so. The Russians, if they are shooting missiles, even if they are intending to hit military targets, if they know that they are grossly inaccurate and they will hit civilian infrastructure, then they are morally culpable for doing so. In other words, it's not good enough. It's not good enough to use shoddy munitions to attack these places far away and end up hitting and killing civilians. That's not good enough. They are as if you didn't know that they were morally abhorrent before. This should give you more reason to think so. And in fact, if we look at all of the video footage of people being hit, of places of clearly civilian places being hit, it's just The headquarters of Ukraine's private energy company, DTEK, located in Kyiv, was hit by a Russian missile strike this morning. Okay, and you could argue that's a strategic hit. Okay, but then when you see a playground park with a massive crater in it, if that had kids in at the time, it's just, there's a whole mixture of stuff that's being hit, and the Russians, we have streets full of burning cars in Kiev that show you that the Russians are indiscriminate in their targets for attack, or at least are knowingly using munitions that are inaccurate, such as the S-300s. But even their cruise missiles are notoriously bad at hitting the targets. And in fact, I've got in my extra video I'll be bringing out later, I'll show you a a missile that the Russians shoot up, and it pretty much goes wrong straight away. So they are using munitions that are generally poorly maintained. Okay, let's go to, very quickly before I get to Frontlines, Crimea, and the idea that the Russians, or the claims that the Russians are making, that they've got the bridge all up and running. I reported on this yesterday. Here's the Kerch Bridge down here, connecting mainland Russia to Crimea, occupied Crimea. There are several road tracks across the bridge and a couple of railway lines. One of the railway lines supposedly has been fixed, but we've also got evidence that the other railway line is not being fixed yet, and there are cranes trying to get these massive fuel freight trucks out the way. Whether they're just going to drop them over the edge in some kind of thanks ecology, I don't know. But they claim to have got one railway line up and running. The question is that one able to take enough freight weight? Is it dangerous? Can they use it to its full potential? But then are they now blocking it to clear the actual train that was hit by the explosion and caused all the fire? So there are claims coming from the Russians all the time saying, "Oh, we've cleared this up," and then okay, they've not cleared it up. They're working on it. Who knows at the moment? But if at best, I imagine it's only partially cleared and operational. The roadway likewise will have part of it will be operational. You've seen the footage of the two parts of one of the road bridges that was completely destroyed, and that ain't going to be fixed in a hurry. Okay, and I'll talk about that in the extra. I've got some stuff from Trent Telenko which will tell you about the Russian inability to fix concrete structures quickly because they don't have the prefab concrete, and I talked about that previously. Anyway, let's get to front lines. Kupiansk to Svatove to Kreminna. So we're going to start up north here. Let's go back to our main map. So up north here. There is still artillery strikes coming from across the border into Russia. The intention is possibly to make the Ukrainians think twice, maybe put some troops up here in case of there being an attack. There's also the rumor that the Belarusians are amassing some troops, and they may attack. So is this Lukashenko finally siding with Putin, the Lukashenko being the leader of Belarus, or is it him trying to flex his muscles to look like he's supporting Russia, but not really supporting because he doesn't want to get involved in the war? What has happened is they have given a bunch of armaments to Russia. It appears working tanks, because Russia have a load of tanks in storage, and we keep seeing them coming out, old tanks, but lots of their tanks have rusted so much that they would require an awful lot of work to get operational again. So it looks like Belarus are just giving them a bunch of, or are selling them, or whatever. A bunch of armaments are coming across from Belarus to Russia by the trainload. So we might see them in action fairly soon. But as far as the front line are concerned, let's start with Kupiansk as on the northern end of this line. It doesn't look like they are concentrating too much right around here near the border, because it's not of great strategic value. However, around Kupiansk, although there's been this sort of push from Kupiansk towards Svatove, actually the Russians are still relatively close to Kupiansk. So it is as you can see here, there's this pink area, which means this is contested, yet this yellow area down here is successfully in the hands of Ukraine. But actually close to Kupiansk, there's still a lot of fighting, and Kupiansk is still under artillery attack. This was my initial mapping from a few days back. So we have Svatove here, we have Kreminna here, and we have Kupiansk up here. I'm just going to go to Kupiansk to begin with. Here's the terrain map that shows you that there's this wooded area to the north of Kupiansk. Here's Kupiansk, here's Svatove. There was this push down from Kupiansk to Svatove with supposedly Kislivka being surrounded, and then Kuzanivka being the place where the Ukrainian push was halted. However, I was saying yesterday, it's pretty messy around here, and we're not quite sure, which town or which village is in whose hands. And actually, I'm not 100% sure anymore that Kislivka is, being surrounded or at least contested by the Ukrainians, because it could be that the line looks a bit more like this. And when I draw a line, by the way, a line doesn't mean literally on one side the Ukrainians are standing, on the other side the Russians are standing. Usually the line will be representing kind of two lines and a grey area in between, a kind of no man's land in between, or an area where they are contested between the two front lines, where you have a line of Russian troops and then some way away a line of Ukrainian troops or defences on the Russian side. So here is the line, but that represents, kind of two lines and somewhere in between. The Ukrainians are attacking up towards Vilshana. They still don't have Tavolshanka. I think that's contested at the moment. They're trying to push on towards there. And really, they're only just the other side of Petropavlivka, which is not too far from Kupiansk. So the Ukrainians aren't that far away from Kupiansk in their lines that they are attacking from, and there's talk about Russian sort of little counter attacks here and there. So the forces are swapping attacks, and it's just not so clear as to what exactly is going on. So if we come down south from here, not a lot of difference from the other day, from yesterday when I was saying, there's a couple of settlements that were liberated. We've got these three towns up along this line of towns that goes along a river here. You can see that tiny little river. We've got Nevsky, and just north of Nevsky, we have Makivka. These have been liberated, but then north of there, we have three towns that are right on the front line and being contested between the Ukrainians and the Russians. Really, the Ukrainians want to be hitting the P-66 and owning that as a line, and then pushing on to Svatove. The word is that, and I did mention this before, a battalion of Wagner mercenaries have been drafted in to support Kreminna. I think they're between Kreminna and Lysychansk in this wooded area down here. And in fact, this has been the scene of two counterattacks that have taken place where the Russians have pushed back. Again, I don't have too much information other than the Ukrainians certainly aren't moving down here. And I wasn't expecting them to move too much, because I think these towns are going to be fairly well defended now. And that's why I was always saying that they should go for Starobilsk and take Svatove and concentrate on that, and then encircle these towns. If you encircle them, hopefully you can do what you did in Liman, which is encircle it, and then the Russians run away. But that's going to be really difficult around here. These are much larger towns, and they are a conurbation, which means that one town kind of moves into another town. And so it's going to be very difficult for the Ukrainians to take these, especially with mobilized troops coming into action. And there has been this operational pause, which has given the opportunity for the Russians to defend themselves. So anyway, not a lot of movement, but watch here. The Wagner are operational here, and I don't think it's going to be an easy task for the Ukrainians to put much pressure to the south of Kreminna. As I say, it's going to be about encircling. Okay, we're going to go back. We're going to go further down south now, move around. So here's the Kreminna, Rubizhny, Severodonetsk, and Lysychansk conurbation. We're going to move down to Bakhmut. Bakhmut is where the Russians have been hitting their head against a wall for many, many weeks, months, and they are taking very small gains. Now, you might think it's quite worrying that the Russians are taking these gains, and even if they take Bakhmut, you might think that's worrying, but then it doesn't really have that much strategic value. And the amount of effort, time and effort, and troops that the Russians are expending in order to take Bakhmut leaves you wondering whether it's really worth it in the end, and whether actually the Ukrainians are just successfully tying up these troops down here. And these are the Wagner mercenaries that are fairly decent. They used to be in the VDV and the Spetsnaz, so the top quality, often top quality Russian contracted troops previously. Then they came out of that and then came into this mercenary group. Although they have been recruiting in prisons and whatnot, the main core of their troops are fairly decent. But if you're tying them up around here, then they can't be used elsewhere. Okay, they've drafted some into Kreminna, and that's what I would have expected to have happened. But, still a lot of them tied up around Bakhmut. Well, you had this, as I reported before, you had these three settlements with Zaitsevo being contested, and these two fall into the Russians. Well, it looks like now the Russians basically occupy all of this area, and they've made a little punch through to a tiny village here off Odradivka, to the west of Odradivka. The idea with Bakhmut is almost certainly that they will try and encircle it. So this is why they're going up around the north here, and they're trying to contest here at Pidhorekny. I was pronouncing it incorrectly, so sorry about that. And they will be trying to cut off this road for supply into Bakhmut, and then I assume they'll be trying to cut off this other road to the southwest or the west of Bakhmut, until only this smaller road is left for supply. We are hearing that Wagner are in the eastern suburbs of Bakhmut now. So it's looking pretty dodgy for Bakhmut, and it will probably fall eventually. The question is, what's going to be left of Bakhmut? Is it going to be worth it? I mean, really. But there you go. It's not looking great there. If we come further south to Donetsk, as in the city of Donetsk, not the oblast. So I talk about oblast, or these are oblasts. I talk about these being similar to states or counties. I don't mean US counties. Someone questioned me about this, and I should be clearer. I mean US states or UK counties. So UK counties are equivalent to US states, although our counties are smaller necessarily because we're a much smaller country. So in the UK, I think oblasts are probably fairly similar to our counties. In America, they'll be similar to the US states. So the state of Donetsk has the city of Donetsk, and the city of Donetsk is actually on the front line, such that Donetsk gets routinely hit every day by Ukrainian artillery, and there are tactical targets that are taken out routinely by the Ukrainians in Donetsk as a city. So the Russians are trying to punch out to the west of Donetsk, and they are successfully doing so. And when I say successfully doing so, they're making about 50 meters a day. So this isn't anything that the Russians should be super proud of when you're talking about some of the advances that Ukrainians have made recently. So here's Donetsk, in this area. Pisky, I talked about in the last couple of days, has been now occupied by the Russians. Well, now they've moved to Pervomaisky, sorry, and this is about, half of this is now under Russian hands. This is contested. So you've got to move west from Donetsk along this road. What will happen there, I don't know. Will it be a lot of effort to gain very little? Who knows? Okay. Let's move down to the Kherson region, so the larger map. We're moving down past this Zaporizhzhia region where not a lot is happening, down to the Kherson region here, the Kherson Oblast with the city down here. Now, there have been there have been recently 3 points of attack for the Ukrainians. To the north of this Kherson region, to the David Brid area here, where you can see there's a tiny salient there, and a tiny little salient or bridgehead here, nearer to the Kherson city. Okay, here we have a zoomed in map. Not a lot has happened. In fact, no territory, as far as I can work out, has swapped hands. We've got a bit of a stalemate. Apparently, there were two attempts at the Ukrainians with quite a good deal of armament to punch through the Russian lines here yesterday, but it was not successful. And this is where the critics are saying the Ukrainians have given away their initiative and thrown away their momentum in order to have an operational pause and a breather, and to get their selves regrouped and to sort out their troops. Now, the critics are saying this is a bad idea because it gives the Russians, there's quite a lot of Russians here, 20 to 25,000 Russians, and you've given them a chance to literally dig trenches in and create defensive lines, which will become increasingly more difficult to overcome given the weather as it changes to be autumnal weather and more rain and get colder. But then on the flip side, other people are rightly saying you can't just keep going on and on and on. These are human beings whose bodies need breaks and they need to refresh themselves or have some kind of rotation. So that takes time, and they have necessarily had to pause. Either way, the end result is the Russians have created a more successful defensive line here. That will be more difficult for the Ukrainians to overcome, as we have seen, if indeed these reports are correct, that the Ukrainians did try 2 attacks yesterday and failed in their attacks to punch through the lines. We shall see whether these areas can be softened with some shaping by artillery and even HIMARS. Who knows? But there is not a lot of change in territory there. In fact, not a lot of change anywhere apart from a couple of minor Russian gains around Bakhmut and Donetsk. Anyway, there you go. I will give you my extra video later, which has all the juicy nuggets and interesting talking points and bits of news and things that I think are worthy of dwelling on. But in the meantime, thank you so much for being with me. Please please like, subscribe, share, just watch, and join if you are able, or support in any other ways. Description is down below. Thank you, and see you later.